Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Tuesday, December the 31st. And welcome to our commentary. Obviously, this is the last day of 2024, and I've got a couple of things I want to say about that, but also talk just a bit about the upcoming 2025 year. And I've got a couple of memories of December 31st that I want to share with you today. Let me begin. I have a post over at the American Thinker today, and this is based on an article that my friend Alan Wall, we've had Alan on the video several times, and he was on the audio podcast many times before as well. As if you remember Alan, he has always been very interested and done a lot of writing about Mexico. And he sent me a fascinating article that he posted on his own website, Mexico News Report. And he posted this website, this information about Mexico is what is happening with the cartels in Mexico. And the cartels are now the fifth largest employer in Mexico. Now, it's a little difficult to calculate, I suppose, since no one actually works for a cartel in the official way that you would work, let's say, for IBM or something like that. But this is a pretty good calculation based on the amount of business and the amount of dollars and the activity that these cartels are in. And what it simply confirms is the power of cash. You know, all that cash coming in, well, obviously, it has to be spent. And one of the ways that it is being spent is by creating all these companies and laundering the money through a lot of different companies that obviously employ a lot of people. So it's a fascinating article, fascinating information. But I think it also indicates just how challenging it's going to be for the incoming Trump administration to tackle this problem, because these cartels are very much a part of the Mexican economy now. They're not just criminal elements. They're now also involved in much of the Mexican economy. So it's going to be a challenge for the incoming Trump administration, a challenge that will go far beyond any military operation. In fact, I think military operations are probably going to be the least likely option. I think what you're going to have to do is work very closely with the Mexican government to see how you can dismantle these organizations. So it's going to be a huge challenge for the Trump administration, and we'll see how it all comes down. I also want to tell you that I think the Trump administration is going to hit the ground running. And the good news here is that President Trump just endorsed Speaker Mike Johnson. So he should have the votes to pass. And I think with Trump's endorsement, he will be able to at least try to get some things done. They've got to get the reconciliation done. That's the first thing they got to do. They've got to tackle a lot of things, but reconciliation, the budget, they got to get that done so they can get it through the Senate. The reconciliation process, of course, is a little bit different than putting up a law on the U.S. Senate floor. So they got to get that done. They got to get the budget done, get it through the Senate and reconciliation. And that's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of time, but it has to be done. It has to be done. And having a united Republican team is going to be the big reason for getting that done. Now let's talk a little bit about a couple of things that happened on this day, December 31st, in the past. A couple of things that I remember. One I remember quite well, and the other one I was too young to remember, but I do recall the morning after. Let's go back to Cuba, 1958, December 31st, 1958. For many people, my parents included, it was a typical December 31st night. As they tell me, they stayed home. They didn't have any plans that night, but they just stayed home and, kind of did what a lot of Cubans did back then. Probably had a pretty good meal, maybe got together with some friends. My brother, my sister, and I, we went to sleep early. We were just kids, and we went to sleep early. And at least, as much as I could tell, I was 6 years old at the time. As much as I could tell, it was another typical night. There was nothing in the air to suggest that something would happen dramatically, but it did. Something dramatic did happen. That night, Batista, who was the dictator at the moment in Cuba, fled the country, leaving the country, leaving a vacuum in the country that they tried to fill through the process. But the reality is that there was a big hole that was eventually filled by the Castro movement that started to come to the city of Havana in the early days of January. So there was a huge opening. Castro filled it. No question that Castro had the support of people. And at the time when he came in, and what I remember more than anything else is the morning of January 1st, the next morning after Batista fled. What I remember was just kind of the commotion, if you will, and the fact that my mom and my dad was on the phone talking to people, my mother was watching the TV, and there just seemed to be a lot of stuff going on. And there I was, just eating breakfast that my mother had made for us, and it just seemed like there was a lot going on. Obviously, I had no idea that this one particular day would have such an impact on my life. I mean, it's probably this is the day that made possible that I came to the United States years later. But it was such an amazing day for any of us who were there, even if you don't quite remember everything that was happening there because you were too young. But as I recall, my parents tell me that there was a lot of excitement. My parents were not supporters of Batista. In fact, they were very disenchanted with Batista. They wanted change. But at the same time, I'm not sure anybody that night predicted the change that would eventually come, especially the communist takeover of Cuba. That I guarantee you that nobody predicted that. I've talked about this with my father, with many other men who were there, who lived through it, and nobody saw what was coming, or nobody understood that change that night would bring about eventually the communist takeover of Cuba. That connection was not made. Now, there were many people, as my father tells me, there were many people who were concerned about, the radicalization of Castro, because there was some concern in Cuba that he was a bit of a radical. But again, I think those people were a very small number. The overwhelming majority of people, from what my parents tell me and what I've been able to read and talk to other people since, what most people, I think, now look back at it and remember change. But no one thought that the change would be what the change turned out to be, and that is a communist Cuba led by a dictator that would eventually bring the Soviet Union into Cuba. So a very complicated night, a very complicated change, but it did happen this night in 1958. That was the night that changed so much of Cuba. And by the way, I'll say one more thing about that night. If you watch the movie The Godfather 2, they have a scene in that movie about that night. It did not happen that way. So if your history of Cuba is based on what you saw on Godfather 2, that is not true. That did not happen. That the idea that people were flying or running to the water to catch their boats, and that didn't happen. That didn't happen. The scenes of just, it just didn't happen that way. It turned out to be a lot more peaceful, from what my parents tell me, that than it's been projected, certainly on that movie, The Godfather 2. Well, now let's go to another December 31st. This one I do remember quite well. And that was December 1967, when the Green Bay Packers and the Dallas Cowboys were playing in the NFC Championship game. Remember, this is before the merger. This is before the American Football League and the National Football League became one. And then they started calling it the Super Bowl shortly after that. This was the National Football Conference, or the National Football League, I should say, championship game. This was the biggest game of the year in the NFL. And I would assume for most football fans, this was probably the biggest game, because at the time, the NFL, of course, had a lot more credibility than the AFL. The AFL was new and trying to get on the front pages. So the Packers and the Cowboys played this game in Green Bay. The temperature was way below zero. With the wind chill factor, it was like 30 or 40 below zero. I think it's still the coldest game ever played, although there was a game in Cincinnati in 1982 or 81 or 82 that was pretty cold, but that was because of the wind. In the case of Wisconsin, it was because the temperatures were down that day in Green Bay. And they couldn't, the ground was frozen. It was a very difficult task. The players did manage to play. Turned out to be a pretty good game between the Packers and the Cowboys. And the Cowboys were leading with a couple of minutes to go. And then the Packers had this great drive, engineered, of course, by the great Bart Starr, running backs like Jim Taylor. And I remember there was a young running back, Donnie Anderson from Texas Tech, who I think was a rookie that year too. He had a great run in that drive. But anyway, they get down to like the 1 yard line and there's 10, 15 seconds left. And, they call a timeout. They figure out what play they're going to run. And then Bart Starr basically walked in or pushed himself in and scored the touchdown. And that, of course, gave the Packers the victory, and that was their first or second trip to the Super Bowl that had already been created, but was not as important, of course, as this game. The Packers went on to play the Raiders, I think, in Super Bowl II. But nevertheless, this particular game, the NFL championship game, was the one that had all the attention and all the following at the time. Then nobody took the Super Bowl that seriously at that point. But the Packers went on to win. It was the second consecutive trip to what was now called the Super Bowl. And it also turned out to be, I believe, the last game by, I think Vince Lombardi retired after that game, or after winning the Super Bowl. He retired. So it was the last NFL game or NFL victory in Green Bay by the late, great Vince Lombardi. It was just a great game. It was just a great game to watch. And I remember watching it with my brother. Of course, we were inside watching it on television, and everybody kept thinking, "Oh my gosh, how is anybody going to be able to survive those cold temperatures?" Well, they did, and you could see people all dressed up for the game. But that was a fantastic memory of something that happened on December 31st. So a couple of December 31st memories for you: the Ice Bowl, the great game between Dallas and Green Bay, and of course, the memories of 1958 when Batista fled Cuba, and obviously the big change came after that. Happy New Year, everybody. I hope you enjoy your December 31st, and we'll try to get together in 2025. Lots to talk about next year. Bye-bye, everybody, and a very happy New Year to everybody.